Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In this episode, I sit down with historian Sean Connolly, and for those of you listening not so attentively, I said Sean Connolly and not Sean Connery. It's a pretty easy way to tell. One's a Irish historian, the other one's dead. So with that being said, his new book, On Every Tide, is an epic, sweeping retelling of Irish immigration throughout the globe and its impact on society. As a proud Irish American, I love the book. I think you will too. It's fabulously well written, very easy read. You can pick this up for anybody, even if they're not a history buff. I guarantee you they will enjoy this book. The link to purchase it is in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Same caveat as always. It's an interview, folks. It's not going to have the exact same level of audio quality, but we try the best we can. All right, I wanted to start with a question about sort of the Irish diaspora in general. In the United States especially, we tend to really focus on the part of the story that implicates the United States. And of Irish immigration to the United States is a big important story, and I'm not saying that it isn't. But one of my favorite things about this book is that it does talk about Irish immigration outside of the United States, which I think is really important. So why is it crucial to consider the Irish diaspora from different standpoints, not just Irish immigration to the United States in the 19th century?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that it's quite understandable that people focus so heavily on the United States. I mean, at the peak of the Irish diaspora in 1891, 2/3 of all the Irish living outside Ireland are in the United States. So that's perfectly fair. But we do have to look beyond, and there's two good reasons for that. The first is, even though the proportion of Irish who went to other destinations is small, their impact on those destinations is huge. About a quarter of the population of Australia at the end of the 19th century are of Irish descent, about 1 in 5 of the population of Canada and New Zealand. So even if these are only a small section of the Irish diaspora, they are very important in those societies. The second reason is that looking at Canada and Australia and New Zealand in particular helps us understand certain things about the United States. For example, people have looked at the Irish in the United States and said, why did they not go to the frontier? And the answer often given is, well, that after the famine, they had lost confidence in working the land as a way of making a living. They were traumatized, or that simply digging a few acres of potatoes with a spade didn't prepare you for successful farming in the New World. However, when you look at Australia and New Zealand, the Irish are just as ready as anybody else to take to the land. And in parts of Canada, they are spectacularly successful farmers. In Ontario, in the 1870s, the Irish, both Catholic and Protestant, are the region's most successful farmers. So whatever is keeping the Irish away from the frontier, it's not a fear of working the land, and it's not an inability. And more generally, when you look at the Irish in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as migrants, they do relatively well. They may come in as poor migrants, but by the end of the 19th century, they have risen substantially to be a well-integrated part of the population. So when we find the Irish in America struggling to make their way, this isn't because, as some people have claimed, that of some sort of cultural baggage they brought with them, that they're incapable of succeeding in a new society. Rather, it's because in the United States, they're arriving in a mature, well-established society with a strong social hierarchy. And like other immigrants, they've no choice but to slot in at the bottom. When they go to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, these are societies still being constructed. The social structure is fluid. There's no established hierarchy keeping newcomers out. And they do just as well as anybody else. So the reason for looking at New Zealand, Australia, Canada is it undermines some simplistic generalizations about the Irish in the United States.
And every experience is different, depending upon where they go. And you do make a good point. The United States at the time, in the mid 19th century, for those listeners unfamiliar, this is certainly still pre-Civil War at this point. The different parts of the United States are more or less welcoming depending upon where you go, but there are caste systems which are already in place in a lot of different areas that are going to restrict the ways in which people can move. In the beginning of the book, you talk about there's this really interesting paraphrasing of a report by George Cornwall Lewis. I'm not sure if I got that name exactly right, from 1834, that I thought was really interesting because it's one of those points where, and you say this in the book as well, that you could see so much of this in the way that different individuals look at immigrants today. He's characterizing the Irish as uncivilized, and if they live in a degraded state, it's simply because it's not due to any discrimination. It's because those are the jobs that they're skilled for, and that's sort of naturally what they're inclined to. So it's a very narrow, elitist view of sort of looking down your nose at the new coming immigrants. But it's interesting because certainly the Irish didn't think of themselves as any less civilized as they move about the world. But I'm interested to hear how this view might have impacted the experience of the Irish as they tried to move throughout the world. Because I don't think that we think about, at least in America, the views of the British towards the Irish in the 19th century.
Yeah, George Cornwall Lewis is a fascinating contemporary witness because in some ways he is completely blinkered and prejudiced. In other ways, he is really sharp and perceptive. At this stage, he's a young man on his way up. He's been commissioned to write this report on the Irish in Great Britain. It's the first stage in what's to be a glittering career. He ends up as British Foreign Secretary, among other things. And you're right. What he says about the Irish is uncomfortably close to the sort of comments you make about immigrants over and over again across the 2 centuries that follow. As you say, his argument is that if the Irish are concentrated in the roughest manual work, it's because they lack the patience and the self-discipline to go into trades, skilled trades. If they're poor, it's because they only work sufficiently to meet the basic necessities of life, and if they have money left over, they drink it, and so on. But he is also very sharp. One of the key points he makes is that the British Industrial Revolution could not have taken place without these people. The transformation that's taking place in front of his eyes, the growth of great new industrial centres in the north of England and Scotland, is only possible because of this extra labour. And he's also clear that this is something completely new. Emigration in the past has been immigrants from rich societies heading out to seize the lands of more vulnerable, less sophisticated societies, like, for example, the Spanish in Central and South America. This is a rich country, Great Britain, turning to a poor country to import cheap labour, just as the United States is beginning to do at the same time. So what you have is the classic pattern of stigmatizing and stereotyping the newcomers, blaming them. They're imported as cheap labour. They're forced, as I said earlier, to slot in at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, and then they're blamed for their own impoverished condition. There is, of course, a whole school of British caricature which presents the Irish as unsophisticated, lacking in intelligence, brutish, violent, and so on. And a lot of this then does carry over into the United States as well, where you get exactly the same sort of cartoonists, for example, using a visual shorthand to present the Irish man with a sloping forehead and a great protruding jaw, a sort of simian appearance, as a shorthand for the notion that these are a lower form of humanity.
The idea of importing and exporting labor is one of those new phenomenon that's sort of brought about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And the part in the book that I really enjoyed, that I never thought about, you kind of think about immigration as being a one-way street, one way or the other. The ship exists to take the people over there, and that's why it's doing that. But you make a really excellent point in the book that this is absolutely a two-way street. You talk about the need, how the British Isles and Europe certainly are desperate for raw materials that are coming from what we would say the New World, the Americas, at this time. But at the same token, you can't be sending an empty ship back. That's not good business. And second of all, the ship needs something for ballast in order to make the transition back and forth. So I thought it was really interesting to think about it in sort of the broader economic concept of what was going on at the time, and how the immigration of Irish people are a key component of that. I thought maybe if you could just talk about that for a second, the listeners would find it interesting.
Certainly. The reason I emphasize this so much is that so much writing about Irish immigration focuses on conditions in Ireland. You talk about an oppressive British government, exploitative landlords, a ruthless system of land tenure, and so on. But what you've got to recognize is that what's happening is all tied up with the growth of an international economy. Yes, conditions in Ireland help to push people into emigrating, but the reason they're able to emigrate is that elsewhere, in Great Britain and then on the other side of the Atlantic, there is a desperate need for their labour. That's why the United States opens its doors to them, despite certain reservations about the quality of the immigrants. And the perfect example of this, as you mentioned, is that the dynamics of transatlantic commerce, the goods coming from America, both British North America, later Canada, and the United States, are bulky. Cotton and timber in particular take up a lot of space. The goods that go back from Great Britain, by contrast, are finished industrial products, machinery, for example, which takes up an awful lot less space. So the ships need a cargo for the voyage west. And so what happens is a Canadian ship with a load of timber arrives in Liverpool. The timber is unloaded. A crew of sailors or carpenters goes down, and in the huge empty hold where the timber was, they rig up flimsy bunks. 3 feet across to accommodate two people. That's 18 inches of space per person, stacked in 2 tiers. 2 bunks below 2 bunks, and they fill the hold with these flimsy sleeping accommodation, and then they pack as many immigrants as they can into this space. And there are meant to be rules about how many people you can pack into the hold of a ship, but they are frequently ignored. Simply, the lists of passengers are incomplete, and you do fill the ship as far as possible. And this gives you ballast. The alternative would have been to fill the hold of the ship with sand or gravel to stop it from capsizing, and it gives you paying passengers, cheap, because you're only looking to fill up the ship for the return voyage, and therefore the cost of the voyage is relatively cheap. And that remains the case up to the 1860s, 1870s. Another dimension of that is that by the end of the 19th century, it's not just the Irish, you're also getting growing numbers of immigrants from elsewhere, from Southern and Eastern Europe in particular. And the passenger trade becomes really big business. At that point, you start getting specialist passenger liners. So instead of cargo ships that are hastily converted for the return voyage, there are ships built specifically to carry passengers. And then you get the opposite problem. These ships cross the Atlantic from east to west, laden with Irish and British and Spanish and Greek and Central European immigrants and so on. And then they have to make the return voyage. And they're specialist passenger liners. You can't just load up with goods. And so one thing that happens is the cost of the return voyage across the Atlantic goes right down because they're anxious to get some passengers on board to make some money and to load the ship up. And so one of the things you get is that in the first half of the 19th century, emigrating from Ireland is permanent. You don't come back. In the late 19th century, very few Irish still come back permanently, but growing numbers are able to come back and pay a visit. Once they've established themselves in the United States, they can get a cheap passage back for a visit to Ireland.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things there that I think are important that come out in the book as well. That, I mean, first of all, it is really important to remember, and I hope that the listeners picked up on this, that there really weren't passenger ships in the mid-19th century. You know, there were transportation ships that were fitted for other purposes, but the idea that there was some sort of ocean-going vessel whose primary purpose was to transport people from Europe to the Americas and vice versa, it simply doesn't exist. You know, the very wealthy could outfit themselves, but that's a separate situation. You know, if you're talking about mass transportation, that's non-existent. And so it's important to recognize that the people who were making this choice to go, if they weren't transported, which we can talk to a little bit later, against their wills, but if they were choosing, you know, this was a harrowing decision. B, it was a one-way decision. There was almost no way that you were going to come back. You know, so it's an irreversible decision. So you talk about push-pull factors a lot with immigration. Certainly there's opportunities for jobs in the United States. They're not well-paying jobs in many cases, but there are jobs. That in and of itself is not necessarily enough to get people to make that choice, however. And some of the statistics that you bring up in the book are illustrative of this, you know, in that we point out that, you know, in 1842, you know, 93,000 total departures, you know, but that number then is going to jump dramatically. By 1847, 224,000 departures. And so that gets us into our push factor, excuse me. And of course, our number one push factor that everybody's going to be aware of is going to be the famine that is going to happen. The famine gets all the attention for valid reasons to a large extent. I wonder if you could dig into some of the numbers that you talk about there to talk about how those statistics show us who was leaving and why they were leaving at what times.
Okay, well, the first point to make is that there is a steady build-up in the numbers leaving between the 1820s and the mid-1840s. The numbers leaving are increasing. But they are still coming mainly from certain counties of Ireland, predominantly from Ulster and from the eastern counties. And this makes sense. It's not the desperately poor are not in a position to leave. Many of them are Irish-speaking, which cuts down the communication with the outside world. Many of them are illiterate, which means they've even less chance of accessing information. They're desperately poor. And it is the people in the more commercialized, economically advanced parts of the country where people are literate, they're English-speaking, they have access to information, they're aware that there are opportunities elsewhere that don't exist at home. So up to 1845, you are looking at a limited pattern of emigration, but also rising numbers. And one of the big questions is, if there had been no famine, if that particular fungus had not appeared to attack the potato crop when it did, what would have happened? Now, it is a speculation, of course, but looking at the figures, between 1831 and 1841, the actual rise, people are still marrying quite early, but the actual rise in population is quite small because of emigration. Emigration is close to taking away the complete natural increase in population. If there were no famine, best guess would be that in 1851 you would have a population no higher than in 1841, possibly a bit lower. and that over the next couple of decades, population would have gradually declined. The Irish population might have stabilised somewhere around 7 million. Instead, with the famine, you get a massive emigration of 2 million or so people in a period of 10 years, and the beginnings of long-term population decline. So the famine does change things, but by accentuating a trend that was already there. The period of the famine itself, of course, people are desperately fleeing from total economic collapse, from fever, starvation, real danger of death. Once the famine is over, however, people continue to leave. And I think that's where the famine makes a real difference, because the sheer volume of people who flee Ireland between about 1845 and the early 1850s creates a substantial Irish community in overseas, in Great Britain, in Canada, but most of all in the United States. So the big difference in the second half, well, there are two big differences in the second half of the 19th century. One is that emigration has now spread to the whole country. During the dire conditions of the famine, people are fleeing from all parts of Ireland, from the poorest areas of the west as well as the more affluent east. And that means that the idea of emigration has now spread. There's no corner of Ireland where emigration isn't seen as an option. And secondly, because there are so many people now living abroad, particularly in the United States, there are very few communities where somebody who's thinking of emigrating doesn't have a brother or a sister or an uncle or a cousin or a former neighbour or a former friend who's now living in Chicago or Philadelphia or Boston. One thing that's now very important is people already in the United States sending back money or prepaid tickets to allow other people to come and join them. And when they arrive, I mean, the first immigrants arriving in the United States have to make their way in a totally strange world. Immigrants arriving in the second half of the 19th century almost certainly have points of contact. People who will take them in hand, who will help them find employment, will help them find somewhere to live, will help them to adjust to the new environment. So in the second half, so where the famine is crucial is in breaking down that sort of psychological obstacles to emigration. It makes emigration, it normalizes emigration, if you like, and it makes it easy by creating this pool of potential helpers on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's something that comes out in the book that I just hadn't thought about before. That you're always going to have a trickle at the beginning, because whoever has to go first has to make their way in whatever the new society is. But once those enclaves start to develop, it becomes, I would say, almost exponentially easier for the next group to come. It's not a little easier, it's dramatically easier for you to make that voyage. But what's interesting is of course, as with any society, at first, America, we want the labor. We want the people to come over who are going to work in the new factories and do the domestic work and so on and so forth, the topic I'll ask you about in a second. But then at a certain point, we decide, okay, we have sufficient numbers, and we prefer it if less people come at this point. Now, some of the things that happen that curb immigration, are well-meaning. You have the American Passenger Act, which is designed to ostensibly improve conditions for people who are coming into American ports. But what that does is, of course, it changes the economics for bringing people. It has to get more expensive now to bring them over. So I'm interested to hear, you start to talk about some American efforts to curb immigration from Ireland that begins to happen in maybe the 1850s, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
It's actually not so much a matter of curbing immigration as trying to limit the influence of the immigrants when they arrive. But yes, I mean, there is considerable disquiet in the United States about the arrival of so many migrants. The Native American, the American-born working class aren't at all happy at the notion that poor immigrants will come and will take their jobs, will work at lower wages than they work, and will undercut their conditions. and the respectable, if you like, are alarmed by this arrival of what they see, like George Cornwall Lewis, what they see as ragged, disorderly immigrants who are a threat to public morals, who are heavy drinkers, who brawl regularly, and of course also who are Catholic. And there is a real fear that the core values of the American Republic will be undermined. People have a strong sense that the American Republic is founded on notions of personal independence, egalitarianism, civic virtue. And now you have these hordes of immigrants coming in who have come from a Europe which is still monarchical, aristocratical, undemocratic, and who don't bring with them any sense of the civic responsibility that goes with living in a democracy. And if they're Catholic, they are also under the control of the Catholic Church, and therefore how can they possibly be loyal citizens of a secular American Republic? Now, it's not just the Irish. There's just as much concern about Germans, particularly Catholic Germans. But the Irish, between 1820 and 1860, the Irish make up about 2 out of every 5 immigrants. So they're a prominent group. And so you get some very ugly incidents of anti-Irish violence, like the riots in Philadelphia in 1844, where Americans, protesters attack Irish areas, burning down houses. And in particular, in the early 1850s, you get the rise of the American Party, better known as the Know Nothing movement, because allegedly its members were told that if anyone asks you about the party, you say, "I know nothing." And the Know Nothing movement has a brief period of spectacular success where they gain control of local government in cities like Boston, of state government in states like Massachusetts, where a high proportion of members of Congress in the early 1850s have know-nothing connections. But the interesting thing is they don't want to end immigration, because they recognize that immigration is crucial to the development of the American Republic. There's all that empty land to be filled up. There's all this work that needs to be done. What they want instead is to end a system where an immigrant can immediately become a citizen and a voter. And instead they say immigrants should have to spend a period of probation of 21 years before they become eligible for citizenship, during which time it's hoped they will absorb the values of American democracy. And they want to retain public employment, for example, of policemen, for American-born citizens only. So it's a bit like George Cornwall Lewis. They are very critical of the immigrants, but they also recognize that they need them.
Yeah, it's a similar, I always tend to, when I talk about, early American history through a lengthy period, America tends to have this addiction to cheap labor, almost from the get-go. And of course, we're producing bales full of cotton in the South using slave labor, and then, it gets transported up to the North, where we need people who are going to work in the factories that are going to turn that cotton into movable textile goods. And, we don't really want to pay them either. Or we want to pay them as little as we can. So, it's a system that's sort of founded on this principle. One of the things in this book that I think is really important that I wanted to make sure I asked you about is, if you look at it from the perspective of American history, any American history book that you pick up is just going to say, and this was the Irish immigration. Irish underlined, big capital I, end of story. They're all Irish. Everyone who's coming over is Irish. We don't need to dig into it any more than that. They're all exactly the same. There's no further need to explore. But as you point out, these people had very different identities, especially depending on when they came, where they came from in the island could dictate a lot of differences for them. So I wonder if you might point out how it's really important that we understand that at different times, the groups of people coming from Ireland were not homogenous.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big issue here is of course religion. When we think of the Irish American, we think of a Catholic. But that's because it's the Catholic Irish Americans who are most visible, because they are most commonly form a visible community, if you like. As I said, mass emigration really takes off in the 1820s. But before that, for 100 years, there had been a smaller scale movement of immigrants, mainly from Ulster and mainly Protestant, who had emigrated, moving into Pennsylvania and adjacent states, mainly moving to the frontier in search of land. Quite different from the migrants of the 19th century who mainly congregate in the big cities. And the big surprise to many people was that in the an awful lot of studies of the Irish Americans, in a sense, were based on preconceived ideas. In other words, people went to Boston, they went to the recognisably Irish districts of South Boston, and they said, here is the Irish America. But in the 1970s and 80s, some sociologists just took the entire population and then looked for people, because the census had asked people, what do you consider your primary ancestry? And they looked for people who thought of their ancestry as Irish. And the big surprise to many people was that a clear majority of these people were in fact Protestant. Now, that's not as surprising as it seems at first sight, because, of course, if you take the family tree of somebody, a Presbyterian from County Antrim who arrives in Carolina in the 1720s, well, that person's family tree has a lot longer to put out branches and for those branches to spread than somebody, a Catholic from Cork, who arrives in Boston in the 1880s or 1890s. So it's not as surprising as it looks. But what it indicates is that the visible Irish tend to be the Catholic Irish. And that's particularly because the Catholic parish becomes, in many cases, the basis of an Irish-dominated community, whereas Protestants are much more likely simply to be absorbed into the white American mainstream. And that's particularly so because elsewhere in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Irish Protestants do have the Orange Order as a sort of badge of identity, if you like. But the Orange Order is never going to be popular in the United States. I mean, its whole ideology is monarchy and empire. And these are not ideas that go down well in a republic that has broken away from British rule. So Irish Protestants are much more inclined to become invisible, to become simply part of the mainstream. The other big division, which I do try and emphasize in the book, is any history of the Irish diaspora has to be as much about women as about men. That the Irish are very unusual in that women are, as likely as men to emigrate. Most European emigration is about 70% male. And the 30% or so minority of women tend to be dependent females, their wives or daughters traveling in a family group. In the second half of the 19th century, in some decades, more than half of the emigrants are women, and they're generally young, single women traveling as independent individuals. That again makes the Irish very different, and there's a whole history out there of the Irish woman in America, which is only now starting to be properly researched.
Yeah, and that was actually taking me into my next question, because you're exactly right. And I do want to stress just how unique that is, especially in the history of immigration to America. It's very rare to see large numbers of young women from anywhere immigrating to America on their own, except when it comes to Ireland. Let me put a caveat on there. Immigrating to America on their own willingly. There's plenty of examples of young women not willingly being taken to the United States. But, in terms of it's their volition to go, like, this is very unique. And a unique aspect is they fill really important jobs in the North. In the South, especially, domestic work is done by enslaved African Americans. But that's not the case in the North, but there's still the need for this domestic labor. And so there's a great part of the book where you talk about the amount of stuff that they have to do. The amount of work that is heaped on these young women. It really humanizes them in a lot of ways. If you could just talk about that for just a minute.
Yeah, I mean, what we have to remember here is that what the 19th century is seeing is the birth of the middle class, economically inactive woman. That increasingly the middle class woman is not expected to work, where in an earlier generation they might have been part of a family business. Instead, she's meant to spend her time maintaining a respectable bourgeois household, socializing, possibly engaging in philanthropic work. And all of that requires an enormous amount of labour by somebody else. Because in the age before modern domestic appliances, the whole business of keeping a house tidy, the endless dusting and sweeping, the lighting of fires, the processing of laundry, cooking of meals, the tidying up is all intensely laborious. And most middle-class households would have one servant, who would therefore be on call pretty well 24 hours a day, a maid of all work. So it is grueling work. And it is very much done by the Irish. As you say, you haven't yet had the Great Migration that's taken large numbers of free African-American women north to become domestic servants. And as I've already mentioned, most of the European immigrants are men. And even where there are women, Southern and Eastern European families are deeply reluctant to see their daughters leave the house for any purpose other than marriage. So it is Irish women who dominate the domestic service. And they actually face a lot of hostility here. There's a whole genre of American satire about what was called Bridget, the Irish maid, who is presented as slovenly, uncouth, unintelligent and unreliable. And there's endless complaints about what they call the servant problem, trying to find a good maid. But at the end of the day, there was nobody else. Middle-class American women desperately needed domestic servants to make their lifestyle possible, and the Irish were what was available. And in fact, I think a lot of the rancor in discussions of the Irish servant essentially are the frustration that comes with helpless dependence. You are dependent on these people, however much you dislike them. And also the evidence indicates that Irish servants knew their power. They're very quick to move from one household to another if they feel they're not being treated properly. They're very quick to take offence and to stand on their rights. So it's a mixed picture. A young woman, and we're talking in many cases, of course, about people in their late teens, who becomes a domestic servant, is forced to endure a lot of essentially psychological abuse and to a laborious routine of work. But this is not, for most people, this is not a lifetime. This is life cycle. It's a period of years where women accumulate savings, and most will then marry and withdraw from domestic service and possibly withdraw from the labour market altogether with the financial cushion of their savings. And I think that this, again, is, if you're talking about the development of an Irish-American community, is very important in two ways. First of all, I mentioned earlier, the Irish are much less likely to go home compared to other immigrants, but that's partly because for Irish male migrants, there are Irish female migrants to marry. An Italian might have to go home to find an Italian wife. An Irish man will find a bride from his own ethnic group. And it's also been pointed out that this has an impact on the integration of the Irish into American society in two ways. First of all, the Irish maid might be subject to a lot of criticism, but the presence of so many Irish maids in so many households does make the Irish familiar to the rest of American society. They become less alien, more familiar. And equally, women who have spent a few years in service bring into their own household a knowledge of American ways and of American standards of domesticity that their husbands, for example, won't have picked up working as labourers on the railway or the roads or whatever. So the whole issue of the Irish domestic servant is crucial to the making of a more integrated Irish and more stable Irish American community.
No, I think it's really important to understand that, and to understand, and then of course, the fact that you're not a maid for life. You're a maid for a specific period of time normally, which then continuously creates the labor demand, which allows more young women to come across and fill those roles. You compare that to the situation ongoing in the American South. An enslaved person is enslaved for their life. There's not that continuous demand that you have to fill those sorts of roles. And so it's a different sort of dynamic, but it's also just, it really does come through in the book. It's a crushing amount of work for a lot of these young women. We tend to have this image of servants of, I don't know, like maybe like a Downton Abbey sort of a thing of, armies of servants running about. But in a middle-class household, there, as you point out, there would be one. And so the dishwasher, the clothes washer, the one who runs the errand, the one who's constantly cleaning these houses, which don't have electricity by and large, so they're dirty a lot. It's one person who's doing all of those things. It's not multiple people. And there's one of the maids in here said something, I'm just so tired. and just reading her recount, I get tired too. But I do want to ask about Australia and South Wales, because it's a very different animal. Certainly Irish are, it's thought of in the United States as only a penal colony. It's not only a penal colony, but certainly some people are taken there for that purpose, but it's really different, and the mining there is what kicks it off. So I was hoping maybe you could just kind of talk about maybe a little bit how that's different from the American experience, just so the audience gets a sense.
Well, yes. The transportation does produce the core of an Irish community, certainly, and I mean there's a lot of very sensational stuff written about transportation, and transportation could be grim for those who refuse to bend. I mean, there are horrendous accounts of the treatment of convicts who remain defiant, whereas convicts who kept their heads down, accepted their transportation, had actually reasonable prospects. You're transported for 7 years. After the first 3 years or so, you're assigned to an employer. Well, initially you're employed in public works. You're assigned to an employer. You have a degree of freedom to do work on your own account and earn money. You can then apply for a ticket of leave, which means you are still subject to supervision, but you can now take a job on your own right. And of course, there was room there for exploitation, but it also meant that by the time a convict had completed their sentence, they were familiar with Australian ways of doing things. They had picked up skills. In the early years, on completing their sentence, they received a grant of land, which creates the nucleus of an Irish farming community. As transportation is phased out, there were assisted emigration schemes, because Australia and New Zealand are desperate to increase the population. Now, they didn't particularly want the Irish. The assisted immigration schemes generally wanted English and Scottish. They had a vision of sturdy English ploughmen and deft Scottish domestic servants who would improve things. But most of the English and Scots don't want to go. They look on Australia as a dumping ground for criminals. It's the Irish, on the other hand, are willing to go. And after decades of living within the United Kingdom, they know how to manipulate the bureaucratic system. They're persistent. They don't get put off by unhelpful officials. And so the Irish get far more than their share of assisted passages to emigrate. And once they arrive, generally speaking, they do well. As I said earlier, many do in fact become farmers. There is no inhibition about taking to the land, contrary to what's been claimed for the United States. And there are relatively few Irish Catholic big industrialists or spectacularly successful entrepreneurs. But otherwise, the economic profile of the Irish is roughly the same as for the population as a whole. I mean, you don't, for example, the proportion of Irish people working in heavy manual work like construction is about the same as for the male population as a whole. You don't get that concentration in the hardest, dirtiest work. And you don't get Irish ghettos. There are no... You don't get whole urban areas dominated by the Irish. They're distributed fairly evenly across the country. So there's a high level of integration. Sorry. Could I, well, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Could I just add then? I think the other way in which Australia, New Zealand and Canada contrast is in terms of politics. The Irish in the United States bring with them a strong sense of historical grievance and are noted for the support they give to successive militant movements, militant nationalist movements such as the Fenians in the 1860s, right up to the Provisional IRA in recent times. The Irish in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, by contrast, give very little support to militant nationalism. They do tend to support Home Rule, limited self-government for Ireland, because that's what Canada, Australia and New Zealand themselves enjoy. But they don't have that sort of defensive tribalism, which the Irish in the United States have. Instead, for the most part, they are they're happy to see themselves as co-founders of thriving colonies within the British Empire. And that reflects, again, the extent to which, arriving in societies still in the process of construction, they're able to claim their share of the credit for the development of these societies into successful, thriving colonies.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize, the difference in experience and how that dictates the way society is shaped. There's a lot more in the book, of course. We don't have time to talk about everything with Australia, South Wales, and so on and so forth. But just know, if you're listening to this, there's a lot more extensive information that's there. But a couple of more questions. Of course, in the United States, the Irish and Catholicism are soldered together, at least in the public imagination. That is the reality of how, I would say, if I were to stop just about anybody on the streets, I'd say, what characteristics do you associate with the Irish in America? Top 3 or top 5? I'm sure Catholicism would come up almost every single time, which maybe to an extent is because of the homogenous way that the Americans did view them coming in. I'm not sure, but how did that happen? I mean, I'm not asking you maybe to do it from the perspective of Americans, but how did the Catholic Church manage to become such an intrinsic institution?
Well, as I've already mentioned, of course, not all of the Irish immigrants are Catholics. I mean, again, what you've got there is a sort of optical illusion, if you like. It's the Catholic Irish who are visible, and therefore we tend to think of the Irish as Catholic. But you are absolutely right. Within the Catholic Church, throughout the English-speaking world, it's true of the United States and of Canada and of Australia and of New Zealand, the Irish have become the dominant force within the Catholic Church. And they have competitors. I mean, there are German Catholics. In Canada, there are French Catholics. In Australia, there's initially quite a powerful group of English Catholics. But it is the Irish who take over. At the end of the 19th century, a full almost 2/3 of the bishops in the United States are either born in Ireland or are of Irish descent. Now, part of that is down to very successful networking, the same political skills that the Irish show elsewhere. They show, and you have a particularly powerful figure, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, Paul Cullen, had previously been a bureaucrat in the Vatican. He speaks and writes perfect Italian. He knows everybody who's worth knowing in the Vatican. And he uses his influence to promote Irish candidates for bishoprics throughout the English-speaking world. And the Vatican comes to see him as their go-to person. When you're looking for a bishop for Melbourne or for Ontario, you go to Cullen and say, who's a good person? But the other thing is simply a matter of language. The Vatican is pragmatic here. They want to see the Catholic Church extend throughout Canada, North America, Australia, New Zealand. And whereas there are French and German and other candidates for preferment, if you want the Catholic Church to do well, then native English speakers are the people to appoint to positions of power who will be able to navigate their way through these societies. So the Irish, you become the dominant force. The Germans are assertive enough to get a degree of power. You get dioceses in the Midwest where you get successions of German bishops, whereas the more later immigrants like the Italians find themselves struggling against an Irish-dominated clergy. And of course, from the point of view of the Irish immigrants, this is very important. When they go to Mass on a Sunday, they're almost certainly addressed from the altar by one of their own countrymen, speaking with their own accents. That the Catholic Church is an institution they can relate to, and it certainly helps to maintain high levels of religious practice.
One of the other ways that I think that the Irish are associated in this country are, with the idea of sort of the political machine, the notion of sort of the secure voting bloc. And it's kind of interesting. I was thinking about, the comments of George Lewis from the beginning, the Irish is unsophisticated and uncivilized and so on and so forth. Well, for an unsophisticated and uncivilized people, they sure learned how to take advantage of the political institutions very quickly that developed, because it wasn't very long before the mayors of New York City and such were at St. Patrick's Day parades to make sure that they got that constituency on their sides. And I mean, how did it happen? Because the Irish, did a great job, I think, of integrating themselves into these key cities in these key sort of Tammany Hall ways. If you could just talk about that for a minute, I think it'd be really illustrative.
Well, the Irish arrive in the United States with very few marketable skills and very little capital, but they do have two enormous advantages. One is that they are familiar with the political institutions and the legal institutions, because, of course, American political institutions are heavily based on the English model. And secondly, they are English-speaking. And this gives them a potential in local municipal politics that not shared by, say, the main rivals initially the Germans, or later by the Italians or others. And they also bring with them direct experience of politics, because from the 1820s onwards in Ireland itself, you'd had a succession of very successful political mass movements. The main figurehead was the famous Daniel O'Connell. And these had been movements in the 1820s demanding the removal of the remaining religious restrictions on Catholics, notably the right to sit in Parliament. And then in the 1830s and 40s, looking for repeal of the Act of Union and the restoration of an Irish Parliament. So the Irish arriving may have seemed like a rough bunch to George Cornwell Lewis and others, but they had practical experience of political organisation. And I suppose more important, they had a transactional view of politics. Getting involved, voting, joining a political association was a way of achieving concrete benefits. And that's a real contrast with people coming from continental Europe, where up to 1848 or later, you still have very much centralised top-down government with virtually no popular political participation. I mean, the Irish have had an education in not just the ways of democratic politics, but the potential of democratic politics to achieve results. And they take that with them. They also have the advantage, of course, that they are concentrated in certain areas. The great majority of the Irish settle in the cities of the East Coast and Midwest, in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and so on. So they are heavily concentrated in powerful blocks. And this allows them to win very considerable political influence at municipal level.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had never thought about the idea that it's very true. Immigrants who are coming, especially from Central and Southern Europe, especially Central or Eastern Europe, if anything, come from a tradition where you don't want to be a member of a political organization, because if you are, you're likely on somebody's list, and you might get a knock on the door in the middle of the night. So whereas the Irish experience is very different, and I think there is a lot of power in the fact that there was a concentration. If there wasn't a concentration, if there's not a high enough concentration for a political bloc, it's not really taken as seriously. But the fact of the matter is that there was. I'm going to jump forward and ask a question about the Troubles. The people who are listening to this will no doubt say, well, you just jump forward about 100 years in history. And the reason is because as I was going through the book, I'll put notes where I think it would be an interesting topic to talk about. And right about midway through the book, I realized I'd put a note about every 10 pages and that I had to get to something modern for someone who is more interested in modern things. So I stopped taking notes for a bit and just got to the Troubles, because also, again, it's a popular cultural topic that has some resonance with people. So I thought I would ask about it. I'm interested to know, what if anything do we know about the Irish diaspora's reaction to the Troubles, and what does that sort of tell us about the way in which, I guess I'm thinking specifically of Irish Americans here right now, but it doesn't have to be, how those people tend to see themselves and their identity vis-a-vis with things that are contemporary that still happen in Ireland. It's a big, big question, and I don't expect a thesis response, but I just thought I'd get your thoughts.
Yeah, it is a big question, but there is a very clear difference between the United States and other areas of Irish settlement. As I said earlier, in the United States, entering at the bottom of the hierarchy and staying there for a long time, the Irish do have a strong sense of grievance. They tend to see their exile as an oppression, a wrong has been done to them. And they support militant nationalist movements, notably the Fenians in the 1860s, where the Irish based in the United States mount several attacks, for example, on Canada, on British territory in Canada. There's also the suggestion that given American attitudes, the American emphasis on independence and egalitarianism, that not to have a country of your own is almost a badge of inferiority. That people like the Irish and the Poles feel that they are looked down on in American society because they haven't won some sort of independence. And that, again, support for militant nationalism is a way of flexing your muscles in American society as well. And this continues. American support for the Irish Republican movement during the Irish Revolution, 1916 to 23, is crucial. And American money, particularly, is crucial to the eventual triumph of Sinn Féin and the IRA and the establishment of an Irish Free State. And when the Troubles in Northern Ireland erupt again from 1969, there is a strong response within Irish America. You get a series of support organisations channeling funds to Sinn Féin and to the IRA, and other agitations, particularly the highly successful attempt to promote the MacBride principles. In other words, that American investment should only be channeled to companies which can show that they are avoiding anti-Catholic discrimination, for example, in Northern Ireland. So there is, within Northern Ireland, within the United States, very strong support, which is crucial to the maintenance of the Republican campaign. A big change takes place there in the 1990s when the Clinton administration begins to try to coax Sinn Féin away from violence and into democratic politics. Because one of the great levers they have is access to America. Sinn Féin organisers have been denied visas from the early 70s onwards. But the Clinton administration begins offering visas, but very much on a probationary basis. First of all, visas to visit briefly, and then visas with permission to fundraise. But this can be withdrawn very quickly. And that is actually crucial to Sinn Féin's changing political ambitions, because by the 1990s, you also have the involvement in Northern Irish affairs, not just of working class Irish Americans, but of a handful of spectacularly successful Irish American entrepreneurs. And suddenly for Sinn Féin, instead of dollars being dropped into collection boxes in South Boston bars, you have the prospect of tapping some of the wealth of corporate America. And that is a major influence on Sinn Féin and a major incentive to move away from violence. Now, in terms of other parts of the Irish diaspora, the picture is completely different. When the Troubles, during the period 1916 to 1923, First World War and afterwards, period of revolution in Ireland, Irish communities in New Zealand, Australia and Canada were torn. They disapproved strongly of the draconian British response, the increasingly ruthless attempts to suppress the Republican movement in Ireland, but also they had very little sympathy with the notion of armed struggle. Seeing themselves as citizens of successful parts of the British Empire, they felt Ireland was entitled to be treated properly, but the violence, on the other hand, received very little support. And again, after 1969, the general impression you get is that you've got to remember here, of course, that direct emigration from Ireland to Canada, Australia and New Zealand has largely ended long before, by the 1920s at the latest. So you're dealing with people who are several generations removed from Ireland, and their general response to the eruption of violence is a degree of support for reform and civil rights for the nationalist population, but the violence of the IRA they either oppose or simply see as an embarrassment.
Well, thank you so much. I want to point out for the people listening, I probably got to about 10% of the book. It's an excellent study that covers a huge, wide-ranging topic, and I really do hope that people pick it up, and especially if you are Irish American, I hope that you consider picking it up, because I think you will learn a lot of things that you didn't know, and will hopefully, learn that it's a much bigger picture than is often presented, especially in histories that focus on the American perspective. And I think that's important. The other thing I do want to make sure that I point out is that I think it's just really well written. It's very readable. Sometimes, people don't want to pick up a history book because they think it's gonna be too dry. It's gonna be too technical, and it's hard to strike that balance sometimes between narrative and making sure that the facts are presented in an adequate way. And I think that this book does about as good of a job of it as I've ever seen anybody do. So it's really worth picking up if it's any sort of subject that interests you, and even if it doesn't, it's just a really good read. I read the whole thing in about 2 days, so it's very well done. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about the book? I know that we talked about an hour here, and that's a lot, but there's a lot of other things I always will try to make sure I give everybody a chance to say anything else if they would like to say it.
Well, I won't go into detail because you're winding up, but I do also try to talk about the astonishing afterlife of the Irish diaspora, in the sense that mass emigration from Ireland to anywhere other than Great Britain largely ends in the 1920s. But what we've seen in the last half century, certainly or since the 1960s, is the flourishing of a sort of international image of Irishness, symbolised above all by the Irish pub, for example. And I do try to explain that as well. But
very true. I mean, there is a great section on Guinness. So fear not. If you pick up a copy of the book, that is absolutely covered within the pages. But I want to thank you very much for joining me. This was a wonderful conversation that I enjoyed immensely, and I think that people will enjoy it as well.
Thank you for having me.